Good morning. Welcome to episode 24 of Nothing Without You, the video blog. I'm still tweaking some of the things I'm doing with the video. I do like the theme music and those title credits, so I'm going to keep those. One thing I had a friend suggest is when I reference the written blog, he kind of likes the old school of me holding the piece of paper up instead of sticking it on the screen. So I'm going to do that at Matthew's suggestion. Here, there you go. Old school right there. There's the address for my written blog. That kind of accompanies a lot of the stuff you'll see here. So if you want to check that out, today we're going to pick right back up in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount. This will be the last video for this week because tomorrow is Friday. And my family is heading down to Hershey for a Christian conference, so we won't be back until late Sunday, so there won't be any more videos till next week. I'm going to try to get this one posted today, which is Thursday, November the 9th. But if for some reason it takes a really, really long time, this will either be Thursday's video or this will be Friday, November 10th's video. But needless to say, it's episode 24, and we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, continuing through it. One thing to notice, this section that we're getting ready to start, we won't get through all of it today, but beginning in verse 21 all the way through verse 48, you have 6 contrasts. If you remember, Jesus has just told everyone that he didn't come to do away with the law. One of the things Jesus was accused of was disregarding or throwing the law away. And he says, I didn't come to do away with the law. In fact, he said, not one little tiny piece of the law, not even one little mark of a letter will pass away. He's like, I came to fulfill it. And then he actually tells the people, listen, he's like, unless your righteousness is even greater than the Pharisees, those legalists, then you won't inherit the kingdom of heaven. But what he's going to do here, there's going to be 6 contrasts where he pulls something from the law. He says, you have heard it said, and that's a reference back to the law. He's like, this is what you've heard, this is what you've been taught, this is what you believe, but I tell you. And by doing so, like I said, he's not doing away with what God had already told him. He's showing him what God always intended in the first place. He's actually not doing away with the law. He's actually defining what God meant. So this is the first of those 6 contrasts. And this is dealing specifically with murder and hatred. So we're going to read our passage. We're just going to stick to the 4 versions that we use, the Christian Standard, the English Standard, the New Living, and the Message. So it says, you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, you fool, will be subject to hellfire. So if you are offering your gift on the altar and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, then come and offer your gift. Reach a settlement quickly with your adversary while you're on the way with him to court, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Then the English Standard. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. And then the New Living. You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. So if you're presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person, then come and offer your sacrifice to God. When you are on your way to court with your adversary, settle your differences quickly. Otherwise, your accuser may hand you over to the judge, who will hand you over to an officer, and you will be thrown into prison. And if that happens, you surely won't be free again until you have paid the last penny. And then Eugene Peterson's The Message. You're familiar with the command to the ancients, do not murder. I'm telling you that anyone who is so much as angry with a brother or sister is guilty of murder. Carelessly call a brother idiot and you might just find yourself hauled into court. Thoughtlessly yell stupid at a sister and you are on the brink of hellfire. The simple moral fact is that words kill. This is how I want you to conduct yourself in these matters. If you enter your place of worship and are about to make an offering and suddenly remember a grudge a friend has against you, abandon your offering, leave immediately, go to this friend and make things right. Then and only then come back and work things out with God. Or say you're out on the street and an old enemy accosts you. Don't lose a minute. Make the first move. Make things right with him. After all, if you leave the first move to him, knowing his track record, you're likely to end up in court, maybe even jail. If that happens, you won't get out without a stiff fine. Like I said, sometimes the message goes in an odd place. That's one where it kind of goes kind of odd there. But we do want to look at this idea. Jesus is quoting one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not take someone's life. It's the 6th commandment out of the 10. And the Pharisees are hung up on the letter of the law. We've been talking about that some in our study in the book of Romans in midweek in the afternoons, is that the Pharisees were hung up on the letter of the law, making sure they got the command down exactly, and they didn't worry so much about the intent. Jesus actually says that your intent behind the murder is just as important, if not more important, than the actual act that you commit. We're going to look at that later as we go through these different contrasts. Now, the punishment progression you hear, judgment, the council, hell, that's probably Jesus using a literary style. He doesn't mean literally these things, but he's saying that as you progress towards these actions and these thoughts, the consequences are more severe. And it's really familiar in Hebrew writings and Hebrew teachings and stuff, so it's probably Jesus using a literary device to make his point. The term there, fool or empty head, is actually an Aramaic word, rakah. He says, and you have to keep in mind, Jesus sometimes called the Pharisees foolish. So he's not saying that there's not a time and a place to tell people that they're ignorant or they're unaware. He says if with malice in your heart you degrade someone, you say that they have no value or no worth, that you in essence are killing them. You're saying that they have no worth whatsoever, even though God created them and gave them worth. He's like, that's just as bad as literally taking their life, because the root of murder is hatred. That's the first step that someone would take before they would go kill somebody, is they have to devalue their life. 1 John 3:15, it actually says, anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. He further builds upon this later in that epistle. So killing someone is wrong. Jesus is not saying not doing away with the command not to murder, but he says even deeper than that. If you look at people in your mind and in your heart and you devalue and think that they're worthless, then in a spiritual sense, on an emotional sense, that you are killing them. You're taking their value, they're taking their life away. And then this next section, he talks about if you're at the temple or you're at the altar and you're bringing your gift. Remember, the Pharisees were really big on making sure that outwardly they were doing all the right things. So this is something that they would make sure that they would do. They made sure that they were there giving their offerings and tithes and all these and making sure people saw it. And Jesus was saying, if you're there doing all these things and in your heart there's hatred, or in your heart there's division with someone else, then you need to stop what you're doing, because your offerings and your sacrifices And these things are useless and they're worthless because you've got issues with other people. Later on in Jesus' ministry, he sums up the entire Old Testament, the entire law in 2 commands. Love God with all of your being, and then love others. The tithes, the offerings, the gifts, the sacrifices, those are a demonstration of our love towards God. But if you have hatred in your heart and there's problems with other people in your heart, then you're not loving others. So therefore, you're breaking the law entirely. Because Jesus says, do 2 things, love God and love others. You can't truly love God and you can't truly worship and serve God if you have hatred in your heart for someone else. And Jesus says, stop what you're doing. Before you offer anything, before you pray, before you give your tithes, before you offer your sacrifice, go back and fix this relationship. That's important. And then lastly, he says, if you have issues, if you have an adversary, if you have someone, settle it quickly. If you don't, then there may be repercussions. There may be legal repercussions. The first section is about people in general, but he says even with your enemies, even with people you have problems with, you need to settle these things. Reconciliation is important. You can't truly worship and love God if you have all these issues down here on earth and these problems with other people, because that's a reflection of our heart. You can't love God and not love people, because God loves people. And even though he's using a metaphor here about earthly litigation, and it kind of sounds like he's saying settle out of court. That's from Mark Moore. Once again, this is one of the references I'm using. Mark Moore says, it sounds like he's saying, well, settle out of court, because once you go to court and it goes in front of a judge, your options are limited. So take care of this. And that's not exactly what Jesus is saying, but what he's trying to say is that the way we handle our relationships here on earth, in the here and now, while we're living, can very well affect our eternal outcome. We can't really love God, and we can't really worship God, and we can't really serve God if we have hatred towards other people in our hearts. If you want to gauge how much you love God and how much you worship God, don't look at how many times you go to church. Don't look at how big your check is. Don't look at all the songs you sing. Look at the way you speak to other people. Look at the way you treat other people. And look at the way you think about other people. Because if you're truly worshiping God and you're loving God, that love is going to reflect back in the way you treat others. So if you think nasty thoughts about people, if you say nasty things to people, and if you do nasty things to people, you're not really worshiping God. And that's what Jesus is trying to get to him. He's like, you guys are so hung up on don't kill. Like, that's the most important thing. He's like, you can do much worse things to people than take their life. You can devalue them. You can dehumanize them. And he says, when you do that, it doesn't matter how righteous you look on the outside. You're not worshiping God, and you don't love God either. So that's the first of these contrasts. The next one we're going to look at in our next video is about adultery. And then there's going to be one about divorce, one about taking oaths, one about retaliation and revenge, and then lastly, love, where Jesus presents these commands, these things that the Pharisees would have been really hung up on, and he presents it as, you have heard it taught or you have heard it said, but let me explain. So that's our section today. I hope you got something out of it. Click like if you like this video. Click you didn't like it if you didn't. Leave a comment, subscribe, tell people about it. And until we see you again, may God our Father give you grace and peace, and you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.